The first light of dawn shimmered on the Pacific as travelers, families, couples, and solo adventurers moved through the busy terminals of Los Angeles International Airport. The air was alive with excitement, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee and the hum of rolling suitcases. For most of those about to board Pacific Skies Flight 205, this was the start of a dream vacation to Hawaii. Days filled with sun, surf, and relaxation. But for one young passenger, it marked the beginning of an unexpected journey. Among the travelers was 12-year-old Lucas Andrews, a reserved boy with sandy brown hair and wide, inquisitive eyes. Clutching a well-loved leather backpack, he walked alongside his mother, Sarah. She had worked tirelessly for a year, balancing 2 jobs to save up for this trip, hoping to bring some joy and escape to their quiet life in a small Oregon town. Lucas was different from most boys his age, shy, introverted, and more intrigued by books than by people. Though he rarely spoke of his interests, Sarah was well aware of his passion for aviation. Lucas's bedroom was plastered with posters of planes, and he would spend hours studying aviation manuals and using flight simulators on their aging computer. "Are you excited, sweetheart?" Sarah asked as they neared the boarding gate, trying to reach her son, who seemed lost in thought. Lucas gave a distracted nod, his gaze fixed on the aircraft outside. A sleek silver Boeing 737-800 gleaming under the California sun. A small smile tugged at his lips. Once on board, they were greeted by friendly flight attendants, and Lucas quickly found his window seat, pressing his face to the glass to watch the world outside shrink with each step they took. He barely noticed other passengers settling in as he scanned the airport activity. His mother, seated beside him, relaxed with a sigh. "Want to sit by the aisle instead?" she offered, aware of his love for gazing at the sky. "No, thanks," he mumbled, not tearing his eyes away from the view. Soon after, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Greg Martin, and I'd like to welcome you to Pacific Skies Flight 205, non-stop to Honolulu. We'll be cruising at 35,000 feet today, with an estimated flight time of just over 5 hours. Conditions look smooth, and we expect to be on time. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." As the plane taxied down the runway, Lucas's heart raced with anticipation. He gripped the armrest tightly as the engines roared to life and the aircraft sped forward. Within moments, they were airborne, watching the earth fall away beneath them as they climbed into the sky. Lucas leaned back, his mind already drifting to the island adventures that awaited him. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the cockpit, where the pilots were guiding them through the endless blue. About an hour into the journey, passengers had settled into their routines. Some dozed while others watched movies, read, or, like Lucas, gazed out at the ocean below. Flight attendants moved calmly through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks with warm smiles, and the cabin's atmosphere was one of relaxed calm as they cruised above the clouds. Then, without warning, a jolt shook the plane. Though not particularly strong, it was enough to make people glance up from their activities with mild unease. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom again, carrying a hint of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're doing everything possible to ensure a smooth ride from here on." Lucas felt his stomach twist, not from the turbulence but from the tension in the captain's voice. Something was clearly wrong. He glanced over at his mother, who gave him a reassuring smile, though he could see the worry etched on her face. The plane steadied momentarily, and a brief sense of relief spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, relaxing slightly, and conversations began to resume. But just as quickly, The plane veered sharply to one side. Gasps and cries echoed through the cabin as it dipped, then righted itself, the turbulence intensifying. Lucas gripped his armrest, his heart pounding. The fear around him was palpable, spreading like wildfire. Yet what concerned him most was the eerie silence from the cockpit. Where was the captain? Suddenly, the plane tilted into a steep descent. Panic screams erupted as the aircraft plummeted, with the ocean looming closer by the second. Lucas's ears popped painfully, and his vision blurred as the G-forces pinned him against his seat. Just when it seemed they were headed straight for the sea, the plane leveled out abruptly, throwing passengers forward in their seats. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling bags and belongings into the aisle. The plane shuddered violently, its engines whirring in protest. Amid the chaos, Lucas's mind raced with a single, chilling thought. Something had gone terribly wrong in the cockpit. He glanced at his mother, gripping the armrest, her knuckles white with fear. "I'm going to check on the pilots," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "What? No, Lucas, stay in your seat," she pleaded, but he was already unbuckling his seatbelt. Before anyone could stop him, Lucas scrambled into the aisle and dashed toward the front of the plane, heart pounding in his ears. He reached the cockpit door, only to find it locked. He banged on it, shouting for the pilots, but there was no answer. A flight attendant appeared, her face stricken with fear. "Honey, you need to sit down. It's not safe here," she said over the noise. "The pilots!" Lucas shouted desperately. "Something's wrong with the pilots." The flight attendant's eyes widened, and she hesitated a moment before grabbing the intercom. "Captain Martin, co-pilot Diaz, can you hear me?" she called, her voice shaky. Silence. Her hands trembling, she entered the emergency access code on the keypad beside the door. With a hiss, the door unlocked and swung open, revealing the scene inside the cockpit. Lucas's stomach churned as he saw both the pilot and co-pilot slumped over in their seats, unconscious. The plane was operating on autopilot, but warning lights flashed across the control panel, signaling they were in serious trouble. The flight attendant gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God!" Fear surged through Lucas, mixing with a rush of adrenaline as he stepped into the cockpit. His mind raced, realizing that the lives of everyone on board were at stake, and there was no one left to help, except him. For a moment, he froze, staring at the complex array of buttons, switches, and screens before him. Reality crashed down like a tidal wave, threatening to overwhelm him. He was just a kid who loved planes, yes, but with no real experience in flying one. But then he remembered the countless hours he'd spent practicing on flight simulators, the late nights spent poring over aviation manuals until he had memorized them. He'd always dreamed of flying, but he never imagined it would be like this. Now wasn't the time for hesitation. He had to try. The flight attendant snapped out of her shock, grabbing his shoulders. "Do you know how to fly this plane?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas swallowed hard and nodded. I know a bit, but I'll need guidance," Lucas admitted, his voice unsteady. The flight attendant looked at him, torn between skepticism and the hope that he might actually know what to do. After a moment's hesitation, she took the headset from the captain's seat and held it to her ear. "This is Flight 205. We have a medical emergency on board. Both pilots are unconscious, and we need assistance immediately. There's a young boy here who might be able to help us fly the plane. Please, we need guidance," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Lucas's heart raced as he settled into the co-pilot's seat, his hands shaking as he reached for the controls. The autopilot kept the plane steady, but warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. He could tell they'd lost altitude during the dive, and the aircraft was struggling to hold its current level. Suddenly, a calm, steady voice came through the radio, breaking the silence in the cockpit. Flight 205, this is Honolulu Control. We're aware of your situation. Young man, can you hear me? Lucas nodded, then realized they couldn't see him. Yes, I can hear you. What's your name, son? Lucas. Lucas Andrews. All right, Lucas. I need you to stay calm and listen closely. We're going to help you get this plane to safety, but you'll need to follow our instructions exactly. Do you understand? Lucas took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. I understand. Good. First, check the status of the pilots. Are they breathing? Lucas turned to the flight attendant, who was already checking the captain's pulse. They're alive, she confirmed, though her voice was strained. But they're still unconscious. Understood. We'll have medical staff ready on the ground. For now, the priority is keeping the plane stable. Lucas, do you see the autopilot panel? Yes, I see it. Good. The plane should be holding steady at 25,000 feet. Is that correct? Lucas scanned the instruments and located the altimeter. No, it's at 22,000 and dropping slowly. There was a slight pause from the controller, a hint of concern in his voice. All right, Lucas, you're going to need to regain some altitude. I'll guide you through disengaging the autopilot so you can adjust the plane's pitch manually. Are you ready? Lucas nodded, then spoke aloud to steady himself. Ready. The controller's instructions came in a calm, methodical manner, and Lucas followed with unwavering concentration. He disengaged the autopilot, feeling the plane immediately respond to his touch. His hands trembled as he carefully pulled back on the yoke, raising the plane's nose. The altimeter needle inched upward, though the climb was slow and nerve-wracking. The aircraft shook as it rose, buffeted by turbulence from all sides. In the cabin, the passengers sat in silence, too frightened to speak. The weight of their lives pressed heavily on Lucas, nearly overwhelming him. For a moment he felt like he couldn't breathe. Then he thought of his mother, seated just a few rows behind, the woman who had worked so hard to make this trip happen for him. He couldn't fail her or any of them. Gradually, the plane reached 25,000 feet and leveled off. Lucas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his heart still pounding wildly. Excellent work, Lucas, the controller said, his voice warm with encouragement. You're doing great. Now we're going to start planning your descent into Honolulu. It's going to be a little tricky, but I believe you can do it. Sweat beaded on Lucas's forehead as he acknowledged, realizing that while he had stabilized the plane, the hardest part was yet to come. As he continued to follow the controller's instructions, an unusual calm settled over him. The fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, but it was now accompanied by a growing determination. He could do this, he had to do this. The descent was a precise operation, demanding meticulous timing and focus. Lucas adjusted the throttle and flaps carefully, watching the airspeed and altitude gauges intently. The voice of the controller was his one constant, a steady guide through the storm of panic surrounding them. The plane gradually descended, the ocean below becoming clearer, the Hawaiian Islands now visible on the horizon. Under different circumstances, this view would have thrilled Lucas, but all he could think about now was the runway at Honolulu International and the lives relying on him to get there safely. In the cabin, passengers clutched their seats, their fear unmistakable. Some whispered prayers. Others comforted their loved ones. But all eyes were fixed on the cockpit, where a 12-year-old boy was working a miracle. Sarah Andrews, Lucas's mother, watched her son with a mix of fear and pride. She had always known he was special, but she never imagined he'd be called to do something so extraordinary. Tears gathered in her eyes as she whispered a silent prayer for his safety. As they passed 10,000 feet, the controller's tone grew more urgent. "Lucas, you're doing an amazing job. We're almost there. I need you to prepare for landing. Can you see the runway?" Lucas squinted through the cockpit window, his heart racing when he spotted the long stretch of concrete extending from the shore. "I see it," he replied. "Good. Now lower the landing gear and start your final approach. Keep the plane steady and aim for the runway's center. You've got this, Lucas." With shaky hands, Lucas reached for the landing gear lever and pulled it. The plane shuddered as the gear deployed, and new alarms blared on the control panel. His breath caught, but the controller's calm voice cut through the noise, grounding him. "Don't worry about the alarms, Lucas. Just focus on the runway. You're doing great." The runway loomed larger with each second, and Lucas could feel the plane resisting his control, turbulence shaking it as he tried to maintain a steady descent. His hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, sweat trickling down his face. "Almost there," urged the controller. "Keep her steady. Steady." The ground rushed up to meet them, and for an instant, it seemed the plane was descending too fast. Lucas resisted the urge to pull up, remembering the controller's advice to trust the instruments. At the last moment, he tilted the nose upward, positioning the wheels for touchdown. The plane hit the runway with a jolt, the tires screeching as they made contact with the tarmac. It bounced once before settling onto the runway, racing down the long stretch of concrete. He quickly activated the reverse thrusters and braked, his whole body tense as he worked to bring the plane to a stop. The runway sped past in a blur, its end rapidly approaching. Lucas could hear the passengers' collective gasp behind him, their fear hanging in the air. Then, gradually, the plane began to slow, the engine's roar fading as they rolled to a halt, just before reaching the runway's end. For a moment, there was silence, a complete, overwhelming silence, as if the world itself held its breath. Then the cabin erupted into cheers and applause. Passengers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces as they realized they were safe. The flight attendants, who had been holding their breath, collapsed into each other's arms, overcome with relief. Lucas sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat, his hands still gripping the yoke. He felt dazed, as if waking from a dream. The reality of what he had done hadn't yet sunk in. The controller's voice crackled through the radio, filled with emotion. "Lucas, you did it. You saved everyone on that plane. You're a hero." But Lucas didn't feel like a hero. He was just a kid who loved planes, a kid who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The weight of what had happened was too vast to comprehend. His mother was the first to reach him, pulling him into a tight embrace. She was crying, her tears soaking his hair as she whispered over and over how proud she was of him. Lucas held on to her as the adrenaline finally started to fade, leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed. As the passengers began to disembark, emergency personnel boarded to attend to the unconscious pilots and ensure everyone was safe. The story of Flight 205 spread quickly, and by the time they reached the terminal, a crowd had gathered to greet them. Reporters and photographers jostled to capture the young boy who had saved an entire plane, but Lucas wasn't interested in the attention. All he wanted was to go home, to be with his mother, and to put the most terrifying day of his life behind him. Yet, as he walked through the airport, surrounded by strangers' cheers and applause, Lucas felt a small flicker of pride. He had done something incredible, something people would remember for years. Though he didn't seek the spotlight, he knew this experience had changed him. He was no longer just the quiet, shy kid from Oregon. He was Lucas Andrews, the boy who had guided a plane and saved everyone on board. In the weeks that followed, life was a whirlwind for Lucas and his mother. The media frenzy around the incident was intense, with offers pouring in for interviews, TV appearances, and even book deals. But Lucas shied away from the attention, preferring to remain out of the limelight. Despite the chaos, he found himself more drawn to aviation than ever. The experience had sparked a passion within him that couldn't be extinguished. He spent hours at the library, devouring every book on flight he could find, and began saving for flying lessons, determined to turn his passion into a career. Pacific Skies, the airline, offered the Andrews family free flights for life as thanks for Lucas's bravery. But the greatest reward for Lucas was realizing that he had found his calling. The sky was no longer just a place of wonder. It was where he belonged. As for Flight 205, it became a legend, a story of the young boy who stepped up when no one else could. Lucas's name became synonymous with courage and heroism. But to those who knew him best, he was still the same thoughtful kid who loved getting lost in the world of airplanes. Although the experience had left its mark on him, Lucas remained humble, always looking toward the horizon, dreaming of the day he would take to the skies again. This time as a fully trained pilot, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him. For Lucas Andrews, the sky wasn't the limit. It was just the beginning.